Have you ever heard of the term DNA vibrations that describes how our behaviours can affect our future families, generations, and mindsets? Now, I hadn't either until my conversation with Lewis Conway Jr. If you're joining us for the first time, I'm Simon Osmo, and I want to welcome you to the Who I Became podcast, where I interview people who share their personal journeys that educate, inform, and inspire. Now, this is part 2 of my conversation with formerly incarcerated Lewis Conway Jr., who was in prison for manslaughter when he stabbed a man who later died. Now, today we cover the importance of African American men having positive role models in their lives and how he became the first formerly incarcerated to run for city office in Texas. But before we dive into today's content, if you haven't already, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the podcast to be notified of all the future episodes. It really helps us grow when you share the content. And if you want to watch the video, head on over to YouTube, where you can watch this and all the other episodes on my channel at Simon Osmo. Now, will you join me as we dive into part 2 of my conversation with Lewis Conway Jr. in what I've titled Formerly Incarcerated to Civil Liberties Strategist.
Welcome to the Who I Became podcast.
Well, welcome to the Who I Became podcast, and today I'm really excited. I'm joined again by Lewis Conway Jr. for part 2 of our conversation. And if you haven't heard the first part, I recommend that you go back. There's some great insight in there. Lewis tells me off and corrects me for some of my knowledge around the criminal justice system and how we should talk about former felons. We talk about his moments of transformation. It's just packed full of some great insights. So if you haven't heard part 1, I'd encourage you to go back and take a listen. But Lewis Conway Jr., thank you for joining me for the Who I Became podcast.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate you having me back, Simon.
Now, I'll just remind people a little bit about, you're a campaign strategist, serial entrepreneur, a national policy advocate. You're a former felon who had a conviction for voluntary manslaughter, spent over 2,000 days in prison, 4,000 days on parole. And it's been an absolute pleasure to get to know you a bit more. And I said in part 1, I'm really grateful for your transparency to share your knowledge of insight. And I know I just want to dive straight into the content, Lewis, and talk to you about positive role models. And me as a Black Englishman living here in Minnesota, you a sort of Black African American. I'm still trying to get to grips as to what that term means. But I didn't have a father in my life. A lot of African Americans, males particularly, don't have father figures in their lives. So maybe let's dive in a little bit about some things you said to me about a generational life cycle around sort of Black men in this country for crime and just not having those sort of mentors in life.
So again, thank you for having me back. I was blessed to grow up with a father, right? And that's one of the reasons why I became an entrepreneur, is because I never knew my father to have a job. He always owned businesses. And I don't ever recall being hungry. I don't ever recall our lights being off. I don't ever recall my mother not being able to get that piece of new furniture she wanted. So he was one of my first influences in learning the mechanics of how to kind of offset being Black. When he was in the Army, his job was to be a computer. And this is before they had computers. So he was a computer. He would calculate the trajectory of the artillery. So, even with the father, I went to prison, right? And that speaks to the generational impact that state violence has had on my DNA over the past 100 years. I found out as I went on Ancestry.com and did some research, and I'd always heard the stories as well. My grandfather, on my dad's side, all of my uncles, every male in my family that has my last name has either done time or has died by gun violence. So there's a generational pull towards trauma that is kind of embedded in my DNA.
Yeah, and that is it's fascinating to me because one of the things I often say to people, particularly on my upbringing from a single parent family, my mother is white and my dad is black. Perhaps I haven't lived in the same type of environment as you, but it is quite hard for me to contextualize that sort of generational cycle of, either crime or just whether sort of system holding you down. Maybe I'm sort of very different than others. I sort of did live in sort of middle class England, but what are some of the causes, or maybe you've touched on some of the causes, but how do those effects come from the generations then? I mean, for if people, if there's crime within your sort of DNA, if you like, why is it that the environment can't change you or didn't change you?
So, in context, my son, my oldest son, who I haven't been in contact with since, his mom, he had a child custody case. My oldest son is a video editor. Now, I used to hold him as a baby when I edited the videos, but there's no reason for him to be a video editor. My youngest son is just into video games, not playing them, but how they work, as I was when I was a kid playing Atari, right? LeBron's son is just as gifted as he is based upon his DNA, right? So there's certain things that translate through DNA or vibrate through DNA that we always don't embrace. We talk about post-traumatic stress, but we don't talk about what that does. And this is kind of esoteric, and this is why Kevin Trudeau made me have a different understanding. There are certain vibrations that happen that allow you to achieve certain manifestations. What the bleep do we know? There's a scene in there where they take a piece of a glass of water, and they project a thought on it, and they freeze it. They project this other thought, they freeze it, and it looks completely different, right? So what that means is there's a DNA vibration based upon the trauma or based upon the decisions that makes it important that I had to stop the generational vibration. I had to shift it, right? And so what that means is no one in my family has ever run for office. No one in my family has ever authored a book. No one in my family has ever directed a film. No one in my family has ever produced an album. You feel what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm creating these vibrational kind of signposts that in the future, hopefully, it will interrupt what I didn't have access to.
Yeah, yeah. And it makes a lot of sense. And I should say I'm laughing at myself because I'm like, I stumbled through my question and I was like, how is Lewis going to answer this? Maybe I'd edit that bit out, but you answered it so well, I now can't edit it out. But there's a lot of truth in what you said. If I can just share some of my opinion on that, it's very, I have two sons, 7 and 9, but they're very different, but the same DNA. And if, like any parent, you sort of say, sometimes your kids do things like, well, that's really like me. And other times you're thinking, that is nothing like me. How does this kid do it? But I get a lot of comfort in what you say, because like I said, I'm not African American. People have tried to put me in that bucket. I consider myself British, even though I'm black. But
I like that.
Yeah. And I can relate to what you're saying, because on my father's side, my father is Nigerian. When my parents met, and my mum is white English, my dad's family in Nigeria were literally living in mud huts. And I often think if my mum hadn't moved back to England, if I hadn't joined the police, I got a mortgage, I bought a house, I bought several houses, I've gone on to be successful. And I look at a lot of the race relations stuff happening here in the US, and you look at my sons, they're white by all accounts. I mean, they're sort of mixed race now, 2 generations. And my point is here is that in future generations, they might even forget that their or their grandkids, they might forget that their great father was this black English guy who came to America, whose parents, lived in poverty in Nigeria in mud huts, who had nothing, but they've just got used to living in middle class America. So I think I can relate to what you said very strongly there, that there is this passing of wealth, this passing of knowledge, which has sometimes been absent, and we haven't got enough time to sort of unpack how a system might have done that. But I just want to share some insight that I can relate to what you said. But the flip side I want to make sure that we move on to, which is a really strong subject, is about, well, how do we change those narratives? And when I was talking to you, you introduced me to your good lady wife and said Simon talked to my wife. She'll arrange this podcast with you, and it's forming those positive relationships. And maybe from even maybe your time being incarcerated and your time out and your sort of advocacy work, maybe talk to us about the importance that you see around particularly African American men having positive influences in their life, be it mentors, life coaches, sort of strong relationships with women.
Absolutely. So I'll try to take all three in a short succession. So one of the things that Kevin Trudeau talks about is, who do you listen to? He says, the first step is, who do you listen to? And he says, you listen to people that have what you want and have been where you are. That's who you listen to. And so once I began to listen to people that had what I wanted and was where I was in my life, that meant I was reaching out to people that had a specific kind of background, but weren't allowing that background to hold them back. When I left the music career, I kind of left something that I thought I was built to do. And when I left it, I never imagined that my conviction would become my springboard, when it had always been the thing that had hidden me. When I became open about my conviction, the doors flung open, right? Because I was obedient. Now, I have to put that into context too. I made an agreement and I kept it. So I was obedient. And through that obedience, God allowed me to experience the things in life that can translate into, I've got health care now, and my wife is able to be my chief of staff and not go to work for somebody else. She can work for us, right? And so the more obedient I became to, who do I listen to, right? And so I'm careful about who I listen to. I listen to people that have what I want and have been where I've been. Eric Thomas. Like my wife would tell you, early in the morning, I'm outside listening to Eric Thomas for the first 20 minutes of my day. If it's not Eric Thomas, it's Inky Johnson. Inky Johnson was, he got paralyzed when he was a 10th round pick for the NFL. People who have lost something that they thought that they were going to do for the rest of their lives. And now, what do you do when God says no? Right? So find someone that has been through what you are going through and has pushed through it. When I came home from prison, I needed information from someone who had experienced reentry. I needed to know how to be a father. I needed to know how to be a son. I needed to know how to apply for a job, to apply for housing. It's not the same. I can't do it like you, right? So there's certain tools and techniques that I learned along the way that would have been very helpful to people who had successfully navigated reentry if I had access to those people and said, hey, man, how do I do this? As opposed to my mother or my father or my wife or my girlfriend saying, well, just keep trying, baby. Just keep trying. It's gonna happen. And 1,000 applications later, I realized that I'm traumatizing myself 1,000 times, not understanding what was driving me back to drugs, not understanding what was driving me back to certain behavior. When had I had somebody that had been through it to tell me, man, you're wasting your time putting in those applications. Go talk to the manager. Go tell him you will work wherever, and then have him go talk to the hiring people. I needed that kind of information that you can only get from somebody that's been through it. So the peer-to-peer concept, the formerly incarcerated people being supported as mentors, either through programs based at the county or the Department of Corrections or community organizations or churches, where we build in these community systems where directly impacted people are leading the conversation on how we interact with formerly incarcerated and justice impacted people.
Yeah. And specifically touch on your wife, if you may, about, because I think one of the points you said to me, which is really true, is you said that you sort of, I think you said something like you saw what a real relationship is about, and I think quite often, if we don't have anyone to learn these things from, well, what does a relationship look like between a healthy relationship look like between a man and a woman if you don't have, you've got nothing to contextualize it with. So maybe talk about the blessings that it was for when your wife came into your life, and what that sort of means to you in your continued transformation, and also sort of growth as a person.
I often refer to my wife as my best 3/4. Right. We often say that there's a misconception about two partial people coming together and forming this whole, as opposed to two whole people coming together and creating a team or a marriage. Right. And so there was a lot of work that she put in, overcoming her fears, overcoming her self-esteem, based upon her mental health interactions with systems where she had nervous breakdowns and she had to be on medication, that really overlaid with the trauma that I experienced at incarceration. And so, as I told you, the first two things that I told her on the phone when we met was, I'm a DJ in a strip club and I've been to prison for 8 years for killing somebody. And my strategy was, if she can get past that, she'll love the rest, right? But from the very beginning, we have treated our marriage as a partnership. We have treated our marriage as a relationship. We have treated our marriage as the merging of two wholes into a stronger entity, right? On our third date, we created a food blog that we just updated today. On our third date, we decided that we wanted to do business together. Even if we weren't in a relationship together, we was going to do business together. And so my wife has been not only that backbone, that inspiration, she has been, the reason why I'm still here. She's often my caretaker. I started experiencing seizures after I ran for office, and there's been numerous of times where if it wasn't for her, there's no telling, or I'd be. So we often don't have examples of what healthy relationships look like because we think they're supposed to come from perfect places. Well, we are two very imperfect people that were never considered the popular ones, that were never considered the ones most likely to make it. But yet together we are cultivating these paths where there are none, leaving a trail for people to follow. And I think that that's what's more important than, I think that that has been the defining ingredient, is that we have never not taken on something because we didn't know how to do it.
Yeah.
Right.
And so if we take that sort of concept of positive role models, relationship, mentors, and seeking out people that have been in our positions before and as to where we want to go. Specifically looking at sort of African American sort of men, how do we get them to that earlier, Lewis, so they do believe in themselves? They can believe that they can break this sort of generational gap. It's a very deep question, but I want to ask it you because we're sort of leading towards it. But, if you were in later in life when you work this out, how can we get to those people earlier to tell them that they have value when we're feeling that the system is sometimes holding them back?
We have to give flawed people visibility. In other words, the people who are most visible are the ones who are most perfect. And if you are flawed, you don't feel like you can achieve that. So to unpack that, or to give that some nuance, when I came home from prison, sure, I saw, the successful people around me. Sure, I saw the lawyers, and sure, I saw the doctors, but I also knew that they didn't have an F on their back too. I also knew that they weren't big and black. So I needed to see somebody that looked like me being amplified in a space that made me say, oh, now if he did it, I know I can do it, right? So again, forging paths where there are none and leaving a trail. I was the first person to run for office in Texas, but it would have been easier had I had a drug offense. It would have been easier had I had a simple DUI. But because the first headline that was written about me was convicted killer runs for office in Texas, if you have a conviction less than murder, you're going to slide under the radar, right? So I needed that. I needed someone who had done it that I could look to and say, man, if he did it, I can too. That's a hood thing, right? But too often it's the basketball player. Too often it's the rapper. It's not the guy that's got the PhD. It's not the guy that went, took himself off the block, got the GED, got the 4-year degree, and decided to become an entrepreneur, right? Those aren't the people who are amplified. It's the people who have never done anything wrong, the people who have always had, the proper pedigree. Those are the ones we lift up. We have to begin to lift up flawed human beings that have overcome.
Yeah, and I think and that's a nice segue into the sort of final piece of our discussion I wanted to get out today, and that was about you ran for, hopefully I've got this right, Lewis, city commissioner in Texas. Was that right? Was it city commissioner?
City council.
City council, and being a former felon, there's a lot of restrictions in the US about what you can and can't do. Maybe talk about, because one thing I like from your advocacy, you are someone who's going to fight for the underdog and fight to change the system, and that system has to be changed from within. And if you can't beat them, you've got to go and join them. So maybe talk to us about your experience in trying to run for city officer.
So the impetus for me running from office came from me helping pass a fair chance hiring ordinance that got challenged at the state level. And once people, within the advocacy community saw me move around the state capitol, someone suggested I should run for office for my district that I grew up in. And that district was being represented by someone who was a very conservative minded individual and didn't see value in some of the things that we felt needed to be uplifted. So, what prompted me to run for office was I saw deficiencies in leadership. I felt like the policies that land on people should be crafted by the people that they land on. I believe that people are experts in their own conditions, and I believe if given the opportunity, any individual can become better than the person that they were. And so when I accepted the challenge to run for office, I realized that it was never going to be a me, it was going to always be a we. And I created a campaign that was rooted in making sure that the most disenfranchised, the most historically removed from the political process, were able to experience a sort of participatory democracy that would define what I was hoping to be a revolution and local politics.
Yeah, and I know you told me, I think you were the first black man to run as a socialist. Was that right? And it allowed you to gain sort
Absolutely.
of national support. And I know that I think you you weren't successful, but you had 11% of the vote, which is an achievement. But there was a lot of controversy afterwards that because you are a former felon, there were people that said, well, should he be allowed to run in the first place? And they tried to implement legislation to prevent either you in the future or future felons being able to run for city office. So maybe talk to me a bit about, your emotions and your feelings about time that, you're sort of 30 years past your conviction, you're doing all this good in society, but the system is still trying to sort of hold you to your former self. I mean, how does that make you feel when someone goes so strongly that, this happened, but we're not going to let it happen again? I mean, how were you feeling convicted there?
So when I first announced that I was going to run for office, one of the prominent black men in Austin commented on the post, convicted felons can't run for office, right? And me not really knowing more than I knew, I realized I could run for Congress and I could run for president. So there was no way in hell I couldn't run for city council. I had done some pro se work and I looked at the election code, and there was an ambiguous statement that said I had to have resolved the disabilities of my conviction or I had to have received a pardon in order to run for office. Well, I took the law to mean what that said. I read it very plainly, resolved my disabilities. Well, the only disability I had was at one point I was on parole and I couldn't vote. Well, now I'm off parole and I can vote. Those are the only disabilities legally I have. Now, if you're referring to social disabilities, that's something different. But the law says I had to resolve the disabilities of my conviction. And so once I presented that argument to the city attorneys, they agreed with me and they felt like I had done so much work, on the front end of helping pass some legislation locally that they wouldn't obstruct my effort. But I didn't know I was challenging a law. I thought I was just on a run for office. Once the race became about me challenging a law, that's when I began to grow my understanding of the impact. It's not just about Texas. It's about 100 million Americans that are suffering disenfranchisement for something that they did 15 or 20 years ago that's continually being held over their head, but they're forced to pay taxes, but they can't represent themselves in a civic manner. And so I began to really have to fight the law on one side and then run for office on the other side. Um, and so you're right. It landed on me kind of harshly that because I was a, and I don't want to use the word threat, but I have to use the word threat. because I was a political threat, right? Because I came with experience in passing bills. I came with advocacy experience. I didn't run a shoddy campaign. They realized that though I was an anomaly, I was something that could be replicated if you change the color, if you change the conviction. I'm a different kind of person, right? So after the campaign was over, a state senator filed a Senate bill that would disallow anyone with a conviction to run if they had not been pardoned. Once we killed that bill in the Senate, they added an amendment that said anyone with a violent conviction couldn't run. And we were able to kill that on the House side. So,
And so, what did you learn about yourself from this? I mean, you went into, if I get my words out, you went into this with good intentions to change the system and try and help people, but that system is trying to sort of force you into that bucket again as a former convict. You can't do this. What did you learn about yourself through that process?
grow wings, right? So I realized Texas was too small for me. I realized that I had to get 80% of my donations came from outside of Texas, right? So what that said to me was when things like that begin to happen, that means the nest is shrinking, right? That means your wings are growing. So I realized in order to have the kind of impact that I was needing to have, I had to work on a national scale. I've got colleagues in Minnesota. Eliza Darris is a good friend of mine that I should connect you with.
Yeah, you can connect me offline. Let's do that.
Yeah, so I had to get out of Texas because those people who know you for who you have been, it's hard for them to see who you're becoming, right? So you got to get out of that space and you got to get into this other space. I remember the conversation I had with a local official when I told him I was leaving, and he said, "Are you sure you want to lose your place in line? All you got to do is just hang around. Are you sure you want to lose your place in line? Man, you just did this big run, man. You're right there. You just hold on." And I was like, wow, y'all are really standing around waiting in line for the opportunity to carry somebody's water. I can't do it. I can't do it, right? So for me and my wife, I realized that my wife was a mental health advocate that needed a national platform. I understood that she was not going to be able to be as effective as she could be in Texas. I realized that I was not going to be able to be as effective as I could be in a Republican state. There are no Black voices formerly incarcerated coming out of Texas, definitely not as radical as mine, right? And so I just realized that I had to be on a different platform. In New York, New Jersey, ACLU affords me the opportunity to do the work with authenticity, but also with the kind of accountability that comes with being part of a 100-year-old organization.
Yeah, and that's great insight. And I want to just sort of follow up with one question, because I know a lot of the topics that we've covered, people are mostly saying there's not enough depth here. This could be a podcast in each one of these buckets. But there's a question I asked you, and your answer was fascinating to me. And again, around the issue of, can convicted felons vote? Can they then go on to sort of serve as politicians? We live in a society where it's freedom for all, right? Everyone can reinvent themselves, everyone can improve and change. And we're talking about your specific conviction, which I understand was a violent crime per definition of the law, but we're talking about 30 years ago and how you transformed yourself. So I wanted to give that bit of background, because the question I asked you is, and again, this is me as a foreign national. I'll declare I'm not I'm not an American. I'm a Brit here living in the US. So I always give my disclaimers. But I said to you, what is it that people are so afraid of with having convicted felons vote? bearing in mind that most of us here believe in transformation and change, and your answer was powerful. So maybe just end on that, Lewis, for my listeners, as is, what is the system so afraid of in giving convicted felons the opportunity to vote and get political change?
We say in this work, you either organize people or you organize power. And what happens is there's a patchwork quilt of state laws that disallow and allow certain people who are on or off parole or probation to vote. But then the majority of people in jails can vote because the people in jails have not been convicted of a crime, the bulk of them. So what the fear is, it's not so much if they're going to vote Democratic or Republican. That's a false narrative. The fear is that those folks are going to realize that their vote matters, that they're going to realize that if you quantify every individual that has an arrest or a conviction and their family members, you create 100 million person voting bloc, right? It doesn't matter your party anymore, right? Now it's about issue. So denying people the right to vote goes back to slavery. It goes back to denying the person access to being an American, access to being a human. So when you deny people the right to vote, it goes back to us being less than a human when we were 3/5 of a man, right? Regardless of the popular vote, regardless of the electoral college, even if we move the federal votes out the way and we talk about down ballot voting, DAs and sheriffs, and we talk about prosecutors, right? When we talk about those instances, when you deny formerly incarcerated people to vote, you are guaranteeing a perpetuation of a system that has historically disenfranchised the same people that can re-enfranchise that system if they were given the opportunity.
Yeah, and you delivered it exactly as you said to me offline, and what I love about that is it's not about which side you're going to vote for, it's knowing that your vote matters and that you vote, that you matter. I mean, that is a powerful tool that the people in there, allowing them to know that you matter, particularly for those that have transformed themselves and are long sort of past their convictions. But Lewis, I know me and you can talk about this stuff all day, every day, and it's fascinating conversation. And we've gone in some different angles, but I think it really demonstrates who you've become, your transformation, the powerful work that you're doing, and just seeing your passion to try and fight now for those considered to be the underdogs. It is a great honor and a privilege to have this conversation with you. So really grateful for you joining me today.
Thank you so much, Simon, for having me.
And I just want to remind people that, it means an awful lot that you listen to this podcast, and wherever you consume this content, please go and like the page, offer comments, offer reviews. There's things that I might have said or Lewis might have said, you might have different views with those. And it's always important that we share our narrative and we discuss different narratives. That's how we improve. So like I said, it means an awful lot to me that you're listening to this, and please go and like the pages. So Lewis Conway Jr., thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for the Who I Became podcast. If you are enjoying the discussions between Simon and his guests, make sure to subscribe, rate, and review, as well as share with your friends on social media. Once again, thank you for joining the Who I Became podcast.